And Ann Perret is joining us here in the KRQE News 13 digital studio once again. Ann, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
You got it. We are here to talk about your latest investigation. This is a deeper look into the numbers of cases dismissed based on victims not cooperating. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay. How did you start looking into this case? Why did you start looking into this?
Well, last summer, a lot of people will remember that 3 Muslim men were killed, and Muhammad Syed ended up being charged. So this all kind of sparked from looking deeper into their family history, their family's interactions with police.
Okay.
There was one case that the 2 sons, there was a police report connected to the 2 sons. They were investigated for a road rage shooting, where in the police report it actually says that the one son fired his gun 11 times at another car in the Walmart parking lot, yet he was not charged with it. Neither was his brother, who was, I believe, the driver, the police report said. So, I called Albuquerque police wondering how could this have happened.
Right, how did this slip through the cracks, so to speak?
Exactly. And I was told, well, the victim in this case decided he no longer wanted to participate, and without his testimony, we couldn't move forward. Then I find out this is actually a huge issue that they've been dealing with for some time, and there was a new commander in charge. He called it an obvious trend and wanted to really just start taking a deeper look into it. So he started tracking it. So that's kind of where it all came from.
Interesting. And that's one of those stories that, you're reporting on one thing and it leads you to ask questions about another. So that's fascinating to hear the background behind that. You talk about in your story, of course, how often this happens, getting some of that perspective from APD. And I do want to bring up a graphic that we have here that kind of gets to some of the data that you share, just specific to a case, or a type of cases, rather, I should say, shootings with injury. If you can maybe elaborate a little bit more on these numbers.
Yes, so I mentioned that there was a commander who started tracking these cases. He came in the fall of 2021, so that's why this graphic is simply all of 2022. But he, again, called it kind of this obvious trend. So these are just his stats from the first year.
Okay.
But there were 302 non-fatal shootings, again, non-domestic violence related shootings, where, again, with it being a non-fatal shooting, that means the person shot or shot at survived. So then he found in about a quarter of those 300 cases, so about 75 of these, the victim decided that they were not going to cooperate. Now, it's important to note that that's both before charges could even be issued. So an example being that road rage shooting that I mentioned, where it didn't even get to the prosecutor's office. But then also cases dismissed after it did get to court, and they just couldn't get to the conviction piece of it because before getting there, the victim decided to no longer participate.
I know in your story you explain some of the reasons why it seems that this happens more often than not. Not to say that these are the catch-all reasons, but 3 of the most common here that we'll kind of go over. I know you mentioned this in your story. Involved in criminal activity, perhaps that person who doesn't want to cooperate is. They maybe fear retaliation, don't trust the justice system. Those are just some of the reasons that seem to be the most common here. One of the cases that's discussed in your story is that of Eric Ford, a guy who has been arrested numerous times, and even more recently in a deadly shooting that happened at a gas station in Albuquerque. What happened in that case? This is a series of all of those mugshots pertaining to Eric Ford's arrest, but what happened in maybe the most recent case that Mr. Ford is accused of?
Yes, so you mentioned the gas station, and we saw some of that footage. That was the Circle K gas station on Wantabo.
Right.
This was a shooting in broad daylight, and I want to just reference my notes to make sure I'm getting this all correct, but he was charged with murder. Albuquerque police say he shot and killed someone in that Circle K parking lot. So the criminal report says that he was inside the gas station causing some sort of issues. The clerk asks him to leave. She follows him out to make sure that he leaves. He punches her in the face. Two men witness this. One of them goes to confront Ford and kind of say, you don't hit women, right? They end up in a physical fight, and then Ford allegedly pulls out a gun, shoots both of them. One of those men did pass away, hence the murder charge for Ford on that one. And then he allegedly drove off. They didn't catch him until the next morning. Those date back to the 90s. And it's this most recent one down in the corner by our logo. That's the one from the most recent mugshot from literally 2 weeks ago. Yeah, about 2 weeks ago at this point.
With those mugshots in mind, he obviously was out of jail when that shooting happened. But has Eric Ford ever faced consequences for any of those arrests? Because I think more broadly, perhaps the criminal history does point to the idea of successfully prosecuting cases and whether or not that those cases actually see their way through the justice system. You obviously mentioned him in your story because one of the cases he was involved in didn't move forward through the prosecutorial process. But just to ask you, has he ever faced consequences before?
Yeah, and only actually a handful of times. You're looking at, I think I counted that there were a total of 18 arrests, and that's just here in New Mexico, but court records show that he has several arrests in California as well. It appears he maybe was living in the Los Angeles area in the 80s and maybe moved here in the 90s, because that's when his criminal record starts here in the Bernalillo County area. But he was charged and was convicted a handful of times. I believe it was close to between 6 and 8 times for stealing cars, drug trafficking, armed robbery, being a felon in possession of a gun. We've had that conversation before. Aggravated battery on a police officer, several different crimes, never murder. And what's interesting about him, in speaking with Commander Jones, who again was the APD commander who is tracking specifically non-fatal shootings that are not domestic violence related, Eric Ford was the perfect example, because his most recent arrest prior to this murder charge, again, that's just 2 weeks old at this point, that prior arrest dates back to 2019. That was a shooting case. He was charged with shooting somebody. It's a non-fatal shooting case. That victim survived. That case actually went through the court system for about a year until that victim decided he no longer wanted to participate in the case, and they couldn't do anything without that guy's testimony, so those charges were dropped. Eric Ford is let out. That was about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago at this point. And why he's the perfect example is not only because, they're seeing people who don't end up being held accountable for non-fatal shootings because victims drop out in those cases, that they then reoffend. But the commander was saying, not only do they reoffend, but their crime appears to always be more heinous. And in this case, it was elevated from just a shooting to now murdering somebody and shooting somebody else are the charges against Ford right now. Perfect example for what he said he's been seeing. And again, that was just 2 weeks ago.
We often hear about that idea of escalation of crimes. And certainly this is an example of a case involving that. I want to talk with you now about the idea of solutions, right? You spoke with the representative from the then Bernalillo County District Attorney's Office. Raul Torres, of course, was the district attorney. Adolfo Mendez is the person interviewed in your story who suggested ways to sort of try to improve the situation, saying it's burdensome for victims, it fatigues them, the number of times victims have to tell their story, including in pre-trial interviews, him citing that as a burdensome matter, and how they are required outside of the courtroom setting. That's a pretrial interview again. So Mendez mentions in the story that New Mexico is, quote, the only state doing this, so to speak. Can you elaborate on maybe just first how problematic this is for prosecutors, the burden on victims?
Yeah, what Mendez was saying is that, it's the amount of times, again, you mentioned that fatigue, the amount of times that they're having to retell their story. So from the initial police call and having to tell police what happened to then maybe some follow-up calls right there from police as they write up the criminal report, then it's the pretrial interview prior to trial. Then they would take the stand in a trial. So, and I believe there's one other time, specifically when it's a felony case, that they're called upon to give some testimony as well. So he's like, this is just, it's too much. And of course, you can't take away the initial police reporting, right? You can't take away sitting on that witness stand during a trial. But he said, I don't understand why we have to have this pretrial interview. And again, as you mentioned, it is not a thing in several other states, in like the 49 other states here in the United States. It's just part of New Mexico's court rule. So it's always been followed. He said, they get almost laughed at when they're asking or looked at like they're crazy when they ask other jurisdictions outside of New Mexico, how do you handle this? Is this frustrating for you guys as well? But on top of that, too, if the pretrial interview isn't done at a specific by a specific deadline, that also can cause a case to be dismissed. So we've seen that specifically with police officers who can't make it to can't make that deadline because they've got their daily job or another court case that they're trying to fulfill their duties for. So it's just kind of a tricky other thing on the to-do list that Mendez is like, nobody else does this. Why do we have to?
Interesting.
So,
is there a better chance that maybe this situation will be addressed by Raul Torres? Because we know he is now the Attorney General, right? That position comes with a lot of clout. It comes with obviously being as well front and center at the idea of maybe pushing legislation or which direction the state should go in terms of how to handle crime. But the question being, is there maybe a better chance that this will be addressed now that Torres is in that position of being the top elected prosecutor in the state?
I believe so personally, just because it is people who have served in his office who have really spoken up about this and spoken up against this. Mendez mentioned that it would have to be a change to the New Mexico court rule. Lawmakers would have to speak up. We know that Raul Torres, as the Attorney General, would have some influence there, right, to encourage lawmakers to kind of come up with something here. We haven't seen anything this session. That's not to say, Raul just took the position, right? So maybe we'll see something next year, but it would have to be a change to that New Mexico court rule before anything is done.
Well, this is an interesting case, and we appreciate you taking a further look into this. It certainly, it's one of those stories that I think, people are exposed to an issue. Perhaps there isn't an obvious apparent solution that comes out of exposing this, but it is illuminating to say that obviously people have a level of concern about what is happening here and what they're seeing here, what the trend is. So thank you for doing the work. What's a good way for people to reach you?
You can always email me at ann.perrette@krqe.com, and on social media, I'm just Ann Perrette.
All right. Ann, thanks again.
Thanks for having me.